Senvith was an important road junction that the Germans needed to seize in order to make it to the Meuse. And Monty ordered that Senvith be evacuated on the 21st of December, but the Americans stayed in their positions surrounding Senvith in spite of Monty's orders, primarily because an incredible snowstorm had snowed them in that morning, and these Americans held back the Germans long enough to ruin the Bulge for both the Germans and the British. Troy was entitled to pride in the Seven Corps, for his divisions had rallied nobly in a furious, delaying struggle that emphasized the resourcefulness of the American soldier. On the south end of Middleton's line, where Luxembourg bulges into the vineyards of the Moselle Valley, Barton's 4th Division had buckled, but it did not break. In valor, however, neither had outshone the broken and bruised 28th. Though overrun by the first wave of Germans that moved out of the mists of the Eifel, the 28th split into a forest full of small delaying units. For 3 sleepless days and nights the embattled troops of that division backed grudgingly towards Bastogne, buying time for the reinforcement of that anchor position. During the first week of that Ardennes offensive, almost 1/4 of the entire division had been reported killed, wounded, or missing. Bradley, page 465. Bastogne was surrounded by Germans, and among those trapped in Bastogne were the 101st Airborne Screaming Eagles Division, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, and the 969th Artillery Battalion that was comprised of American soldiers of African descent. And they were all short on food and medical supplies, and by the 22nd were down to 10 rounds of ammo each per day. When the weather cleared after Patton prayed, the Americans were able to drop supplies by air into Bastogne, and Patton arrived the following day on the 26th of December, after which Ike ordered the complete desegregation of all American soldiers of African descent. When the weather cleared on the 23rd, the American Air Force was able to attack the Germans heading to the Meuse, and the Germans were stopped well short of the river, even though Monty was still holding the bridges open for them at Namur, Dinant, and Givet. And the Americans quickly took over these bridges from Monty. Doctors flew into Bastogne in a glider, and by Christmas it was a clear American victory, but Hitler would not give permission for his German soldiers to retreat until the 16th of January, after 120,000 German casualties outnumbered American casualties, many of whom had died from the cold. Namur on the Meuse River had been held by Germany throughout the Great War, and Dinant was 20 miles south of Namur, and Givet had been occupied by Germans until the 7th of September, and the German advance was stopped by the Americans 6 miles away from Givet, after which 11,000 American soldiers moved into Givet's fortress of Charlemont. 29 August 1944. Arrived Monty's HQ by 2 p.m., had lunch with him and long talk with him about recent crisis with Eisenhower. Apparently he'd succeeded in arriving at a suitable compromise by which 1st U.S. Army is to move on the right of 21st Army Group and head for area Charleroi, Namur, Liège, just north of Ardennes. Only unsatisfactory part is that this army is not under Monty's orders, and he can only coordinate its actions in relation to 21st Army Group. This may work. It remains to be seen what political pressure is put on Eisenhower to move Americans on separate axis from the British. War Diaries, 1939 to 1945, by Field Marshal Lord Allenbrook, edited by Alex Danchev and Daniel Todman, L.A., University of California Press, 1957-2001, page 586. 28 November 1944. Jumbo Wilson came to attend our COS Chief of Staff meeting and gave us his views on future operations in Italy and across to the Dalmatian coast. At 12:30 I went to see the PM, having asked for an interview with him. I told him I was very worried with the course operations we're taking on the Western Front. I said that when we looked facts in the face this last offensive could only be classified as the first strategic reverse that we had suffered since landing in France. I said that in my mind 2 main factors were at fault, i.e., A, American strategy, and B, American organization. As regards the strategy, I said that I considered Bradley should be made the commander of the land forces and the front divided into 2 groups of armies instead of 3, with the Ardennes between them, Montgomery to command the northern and Devers the southern. Winston said that he was also worried about the Western Front. He agreed with most of what I said, but was doubtful as to the necessity for a land force commander. I think I succeeded in pointing out that we must take the control out of Eisenhower's hands, and the best plan was to repeat what we did in Tunisia when we brought in Alex as a deputy to Eisenhower to command the land forces for him. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 629 and 30. 29 November 1944. Received telegram this morning from Monty. He had had a long talk with Eisenhower. The latter had agreed that strategy was wrong, that results of offensive were strategic reverse, that front wanted reorganizing, would not agree that commander of land forces was necessary, but prepared to put Bradley with a large group north of the Ardennes under Monty's orders, leaving Devers south of the Ardennes. This may be all right, but I still have grave doubts, as Ike is incapable of running a land battle, and it is all dependent on how well Monty can handle him. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 630. 1 December 1944. In the evening went to see a new film on America which we have prepared to educate the army. I think it is good and should help in getting our soldiers to understand the Americans. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 631. 12 December 1944. Ike explained his plan, which contemplates a double advance into Germany, north of Rhine and by Frankfurt. I disagreed flatly with it, and pointed out impossibility of double invasion with limited forces he had got. I stressed the importance of concentrating on one thrust. I drew attention to the fact that with his limited forces any thought of attack on both fronts could only lead to dispersal of effort. Quite impossible to get the PM to even begin to understand the importance of the principles involved. Half the time his attention was concentrated on the possibility of floating mines down the Rhine! ! War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 634. 17 December 1944. Spent quietly at home. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 636. 20 December 1944. Received telegram from Monty which showed clearly that the situation in France was serious. American front penetrated. Germans advancing on Namur with little in front of them. North flank of 1st American Army in state of flux and disorganization, etc., etc. Also suggesting that he should be given command of all forces north of the penetration. I sent copy to the PM, who sent for me at 3:30 in the map room. I found him very much the worse for wear, having evidently consumed several glasses of brandy at lunch. It was not very easy to ensure that he was absorbing the seriousness of the situation. We had many references to Marlborough and other irrelevant matters. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 637. 22 December 1944. German offensive appears to be held in the north, but I am a little more doubtful about the south. Patton is reported to have put in a counterattack. This could only have been a half-baked affair, and I doubt it's doing much good. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 637. 23 December, 1944. According to Monty, 23 December, 1944. According to Monty, Ike agrees that the front should now be divided in two, and that only one major offensive is possible, but I expect that whoever meets Ike next may swing him to any other point of view! ! He is a hopeless commander. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 638. Monty's demand that he be given command of the Americans north of the Bulge due to communications being cut proved to be unfounded, as Bradley reported. Our lines through Bastogne had been cut, but an auxiliary circuit had been run across the western tip of the Ardennes. Still another was being strung for safety's sake behind the Meuse. As long as the enemy was contained within the Meuse, it seemed unlikely that we would lose all our long lines to either the 1st or 9th Armies, and as a matter of fact, we never did. Bradley, page 466. On the eve of Patton's attack toward the U.S. redoubt at Bastogne, Montgomery radioed that he was planning to delay the companion attack from the north, for which Hodges had massed Collins' 7 Corps. He had chosen instead to quote-unquote tidy up the defenses on his front before undertaking a counteroffensive. As a result, the divisions that had been gathered for Collins's attack were dispersed on a retaining wall, and the enemy continued to hold the initiative on the northern edge of the Bulge. It was not until January 3, 12 days later, that Montgomery completed his primping and attacked. Bradley, page 468. On the 26th of December, Bradley called Ike to prompt him to get Monty into action, but Ike was not in. So Bradley spoke to Ike's British aide. "Damn it, Beetle, can't you people get Monty going on the north? As near as we can tell, this other fellow's reached his high water mark today. He'll soon be starting to pull back. If not tonight, certainly by tomorrow." But Beetle disputed this optimistic appraisal, for Schaeff had been surfeited with the apprehensive estimates of 21st Group. "Oh, no, Brad, you're mistaken," he said. "Why, they'll be across the Meuse in 48 hours. "Nuts," I answered, plagiarizing McAuliffe for the lack of any other retort. Bradley, page 472. Those of us in the 82nd were eager to get on with it, feeling that we could go just as far as we would be allowed to go, and we also believed that the harder the attack was made right at the outset, the better off we would be. In the first day's fighting, the 82nd completely overran the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division and the 9th SS Panzer Division, capturing 2,400 prisoners, including 5 battalion commanders. After a few days, the division was told to hold up. It was then that we became aware that the Army's attack plan was based on a huge turning action pivoted on Stavelot. It was as though a huge stable door were being closed. The movement of the divisions was controlled by phase lines. In the case of the 82nd, we crossed the open ground at our front, made our way through waist-deep snow and tall timber on the highland, and came to the open valley looking across to Thiers, Dumont, and Filsaume, around Verdun. When the 505th reached the position, they saw a German truck column approaching. They allowed it to come all the way up to their positions and then destroyed it and captured all the Germans. Prisoners told them that they were the Corps Reserve, that the Germans were committing to restore their positions, but so unaware were the Germans of the plight of the 62nd Volksgrenadier and the 9th SS Panzer that they committed their reserves right into our welcoming arms. On to Berlin. Battles of an Airborne Commander, 1943 to 1946, by James M. Gavin, New York, Bantam Books, then Viking Press, 1978, page 276. While the Americans were succeeding in stopping the Bulge, Von Rundstedt's final attempt with 5th Panzer Army was spearheaded towards Brussels for a meeting with Monty to make terms. Throughout all this, the ubiquitous British field officer and a phantom jeep and radio stayed in close touch with us. Field Marshal Montgomery had a policy of stationing a young field officer at every division headquarters. His mission there was to keep Montgomery's headquarters informed at once of everything that was taking place. On to Berlin, page 262 and 3. Almost as soon as the changeover brought Hodges and Simpson's armies under his 21st Group, Montgomery hurried a liaison officer down to the Meuse to ascertain in a first-hand report whether the enemy had anywhere crossed it. Hodges could have readily told him the German had not. Bradley, page 468. On the 15th of December, Monty had written Ike a letter asking for permission to go home for Christmas, saying he'd already given orders for his next big offensive, but it was obvious he just wanted to be in London for his big ending the war by Christmas triumphal parade. And the week before the Bulge, the British newspapers had been writing hit pieces against Ike, saying that he was too busy to be an effective ground commander and that Monty should be put in charge of all ground actions for the remainder of the war. On the 3rd of December, the Americans had built a copy of the V-1 rocket buzz bomb and wanted to ship the first 100 over, but the British had said there wasn't enough shipping available. Major General Ernest N. Harmon of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division was like a caged lion this Christmas Eve. He was receiving reports of large numbers of German tanks in the vicinity of Celles, many of them immobilized for lack of gasoline. Here was a real opportunity! On the night of the 22nd, Old Gravel Voice had closed his veteran Hell on Wheels 2nd Armor into its assembly area some 12 miles north of Marsh. The next morning he'd sent patrols from the 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion to the south and southwest. As he was conferring with some of his commanders, he'd been notified that one of his armored cars on a patrol had been shot up at a hamlet near Ciney, a road junction joining the arteries from Marsh, Rochefort, Dinant, and Namur. Harmon acted promptly. Without awaiting orders, he dispatched his Combat Command A under Brigadier General John Collier in the direction of Ciney. On arrival, Collier's men had found the report false. British armoured patrols from the 3rd Regiment of the 29th Royal Tank Brigade were in the town, and no enemy was in sight. However, reports of large forces moving towards Ciney had made it pointless to try to hide the location of the 2nd Armoured any longer, so Harmon had deployed Collier's CCA from Ciney to Haid, and had given Collier the job of pushing southward in the direction of Rochefort. Attached to his division on his left flank the morning of December 24 was the 24th Reconnaissance Squadron of the 4th Cavalry Group. CCB and CCR, in the rear and still out of contact, were not to be employed without permission of higher headquarters. As additional reports came in, Harmon took further action. During the morning in the area of Celles, CL in brackets, just 5 miles southwest of Ciney and Canjou, some British light armoured cavalry had been forced back towards Dinant. When 2 American P-51s had flown over Celles, they had received heavy flak. Harmon did not wait for confirmation. Without delay, he ordered CCB, under Brigadier General Isaac D. White, to move westward to back up CCA at Ciney and to secure the town, quote, unquote, as a base for further operations, close quote. At the same time, he sent 2 battalions of self-propelled artillery into firing positions. In the early afternoon, Christmas Eve, he called headquarters, 7 Corps, for permission to wipe out these German tanks in their exposed position. That afternoon, General Palmer's military career, as well as that of his chief, received a critical test. It was Palmer who received Harman's phone call urgently requesting permission to attack the German 2nd Panzer Division in the general area of Sine-Celles. The German units out of gas were sitting ducks, said Harman. This, however, would entail a change in major policy, and as such, Palmer judged, would far exceed his authority. He advised Harman to await the arrival of General Collins, who was on the road to the CP of the 2nd Armored Division. Harman would not accept Palmer's answer. A few minutes later he was on the phone again requesting, quote, immediate authority, close quote. Sorely tempted, Palmer authorized Harman to make preparations for the attack, but still to hold up, pending General Collins's arrival. In so ordering, General Palmer was well aware of the attitude prevailing at First Army. Across the front some things were looking good, others were not. True, Jochen Piper had evacuated his position at L'Église, leaving much booty behind, but the severe attacks against the 82nd Armored and its exposed salient had caused Field Marshal Montgomery to order its withdrawal that day to the line of Troy-Ponce, 3 Points, and Manhay. Parker's crossroads had fallen. Elements of the 75th Infantry Division were in trouble at Deschamps. Furthermore, the 116th Panzer Division was beginning to attack at Verdun, and there was a strong possibility of enemy reinforcement on the First Army front by the German 9th Panzer Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. Montgomery that day had visited General Hodges, whose command post had now moved north of the Meuse to Tongres, and relieved his mind somewhat with the news that the 51st British Highland Division was coming across the Meuse into a backstop position and would constitute Hodges' reserve. Moreover, the British 29th Armoured Brigade with 50 tanks would cross east of the Meuse, protect Namur, Dinant, and Givet, and make contact with the west flank of 7 Corps. But these were defensive measures. Obviously, Montgomery was not yet thinking offensively. But Palmer, fretting at Collins's CP at Mayon, was also impatient. Soon he in turn was on the phone with the First Army Chief of Staff, Major General Bill Keane. Keane had news, although it was somewhat confusing. He notified Palmer that a liaison officer, Colonel R.F. Red Acres, was en route from Tongres to Mayon with important oral instructions. Collins, Keane said cautiously, was authorized to use his troops in any way he saw fit, but Palmer wanted something more concrete. Keane tried to comply. In the transparent double talk that sometimes passes for security, Keane asked Palmer to pick up his map and find 2 towns whose names begin with A and H. Palmer, looking to the south, found the towns of Achine and Le Huys. Palmer was elated. To attack to that line coincided exactly with the axis of advance that Harman wanted to follow to hit the 2nd Panzer. Back at Tongres, General Keane was concerned. From the tone in Palmer's voice, just possibly the message had been misconstrued. Keane called again and repeated that Acres was en route, and that Collins was granted complete freedom to use all his troops, but he then said, "Now get this. I'm only going to say it once. Emphasis. Roll with the punch." End emphasis. Looking at the map for a logical place to fall back, Palmer looked for 2 other towns beginning with A and H. To his distress, he found Andon and Huy on the Meuse River and 30 miles north of the other 2 towns. This completely reversed his previous understanding. 7 Corps was to withdraw! ! Finally, after a long, hard trip over crowded roads on a cold, bitter night, Akers arrived. A drink of hot rum seemed to revive him, and he delivered his oral instructions, which differed in 2 particulars from the tenor of the telephone conversations. For one thing, Houghton, not Huy, was the town whose name began with H. This would imply withdrawing the 7 Corps flank and giving up Marche and the entire road net east of the Meuse River, including the roads to Givet, Dinant, and Namur. To Collins this was unthinkable. However, Akers' statements also seemed to give Collins more discretion than had been indicated from the guarded conversations between Palmer and Keane. Now even the aggressive Lightning Joe was in a quandary. His mind went back to the late 30s, when he'd been an instructor at the infantry school in Fort Benning, Georgia. There, as a member of the faculty, it had been his duty to give a series of lectures to reserve officers at Anniston and Birmingham, Alabama. One of the lessons, Collins now recalled, had involved the First Battle of the Marne, when a German liaison officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hensch, had been dispatched from General Helmuth von Moltke to convey verbal instructions to General Alexander von Kluck of the German First Army. These instructions had resulted in a premature retirement of the First Army on September 9, 1914. This action probably saved the French Sixth Army from annihilation, thereby contributing to a French victory. Since the instructions had been oral, however, Kluck had since been blamed for losing the battle. The thought flashed through Collins' mind, "My God," emphasis, "My God, is history repeating itself?" End emphasis. Determined he would not make the same mistake as Kluck, General Collins requested Colonel Akers to put his oral instructions in writing. This Akers was glad to do, and soon the following message was in Collins's hands. 24 December, 1944. Subject, confirmation of oral instructions. 2. Commanding General, 7 Corps, APO 307, United States Army. 1. In compliance with instructions received from Field Marshal Montgomery, CNC 21 Army Group, Commanding General, 1st United States Army is endeavoring to shorten the line now held by 1st Army units to halt the advance of the enemy and stabilize the line. 2. For the time being, the 7 Corps is released from all offensive missions and will go on the defensive with the objective of stabilizing the right flank of 1st United States Army. Commanding General 7 Corps is hereby authorized to use all forces at his disposal to accomplish this job. Command General 7 Corps is authorized, whenever in his opinion he considers it necessary, to drop back to the general line Andon-Houghton-Manhay. In the event that the line drops back this far, the bridge at Andon will be secured. Firm contact on the left will be maintained with XVIII 18 Airborne Corps in the vicinity of Manhay by command of Lieutenant General Hodges, R.F. Akers, Jr., Colonel GSC G3 Ops. At the bottom, General Collins typed, "Note: the above instructions were typed personally by Colonel R.F. Akers, Jr. at Headquarters 7 Corps at Meon, Belgium, the evening of 24 December, 1944. Colonel Akers had been sent by CG 1st Army to deliver these instructions orally to the CG 7 Corps. But even with this authority, Collins could not reconcile himself to withdrawal rather than attack. Massed American artillery, 11 battalions of it east of Marsh, could smash any German attacks up the defile of the Liège road. Ernie Harman, on the right, should not be denied. The situation was touchy, and the decision was wholly in his hands. He was quote-unquote authorized, but not ordered. He decided to attack. By the end of Christmas Day, they had trapped a substantial part of the 2nd Panzer Division. The Bitter Woods, page 367 through 72, emphasis his. That Christmas Day, Field Marshal Model visited the front. He had delivered an optimistic Christmas Day speech, and now his staff was well aware of the U.S. Third Army's attack from the south approaching Bastogne, and the situation in the area of Marsh, with containing action at Elsenborn. The remarkable thing about Model's message was his airy optimism. The 5th Panzer Army had pierced the Allied defenses, and its advance units were almost at the Meuse near Dinant. Model had a reputation for keeping himself well informed, and Model suggested that the 5th Panzer Army should continue to seize, quote, unoccupied, close quote, crossings over the Meuse, but that the bulk of the army should go to Ciney and head northeast to roll up the Allied north flank. Bastogne should be taken. Having signed and dispatched the telegram, General Field Marshal Model sat down in front of the fireplace to a good dinner and his usual bottle of Burgundy. The Bitter Woods, page 373 and 4. On the evening of December 26, 1944, the day of the quote-unquote high water mark, General Eisenhower was preparing to leave for Brussels to meet with Field Marshal Montgomery. He had tried to go 3 days earlier, but air travel had been ruled out, and the lengthy road trip would have kept him absent from his headquarters for several days. The Supreme Commander was fretful. Though telephone communications were satisfactory, Eisenhower wanted to see his commanders personally. But more frustration was in store. The train scheduled for the trip was bombed by the Luftwaffe that evening, and the trip had to be postponed one more day. The Bitter Woods, page 379. At 21 Army Group headquarters, Montgomery was once more in the process of disengaging Collins's 7th Corps to reconstitute Hodges' reserve. Collins and Hodges both had been trying to convince Montgomery that a counterattack from the north could soon be launched, but he still seemed to feel that another major German attack northward might hit First Army, Ibid. On the 30th of December, Monty sent a letter to Ike demanding overall control of the theater. And on New Year's Eve, Monty was told that Ike had prepared a telegram to FDR demanding that Schaeff choose between him and Monty. Eisenhower had decided that either he or Montgomery would have to go. They could no longer work together. "I've just come from Schaeff," de Gingan said, "and seen Ike, and it's in the cards that you might have to go." He explained the frame of mind existing in the American command and the Supreme Command. He told a completely baffled Montgomery of the telegram waiting to be sent from Versailles to Washington. After all, as de Gingan said, if the choice was between Montgomery and Eisenhower, it was inconceivable that Eisenhower would be the one to go. And the Americans were now contributing by far the more men and material to the war effort. Not even Churchill could save Montgomery under these circumstances. The Bitter Woods, page 383. The footnote read, Churchill and Brooke had earlier assured Eisenhower that they would replace any British officer at the request of the Supreme Commander. Dwight Eisenhower, Crusade in Europe, New York Doubleday, 1948, page 317. Hitler refused a request from his generals to retreat back to the Siegfried Line due to the disagreement and confusion at Allied headquarters. and Hitler ordered every commander to reach the Meuse without fail, to cross the river, and reach Liège with its massive American supply dump, while the Americans in the Hürtgen forest would be flooded out as soon as the Germans were safely on the other side of the Meuse, so the Germans could blow the Roer dams, at which point the British would have a clear reason for coming to terms in a separate peace. But the German tank commander, who almost reached the Meuse, had been using a copy of one of Churchill's old Austrian naval maps, and the road he was going down was not on the outdated map, so when he was almost to a crucial American gasoline dump before reaching the Meuse, he took a wrong turn and ran out of gas. First Army had removed more than 1 million gallons of motor fuel from the enemy's reach. Another 124,000 gallons were ignited to prevent their capture, and a third dump of 2,225,000 gallons was in the process of being removed to the rear. Bradley, page 465. Now faced with a major battle instead of the breakthrough he had planned to the Meuse, von Rundstedt shifted the main force of his drive to Manteufels. At the same time, he committed his remaining reserves in the gap that had been opened north of Bastogne and attacked due westward. Bradley, page 469. Of course, the towns with the names of A and H could have been the twin hamlets of Aschuf and Houffalize, 10 miles north of Bastogne. But it would all work out, because the Germans had another problem, in that they were pouring their gas out of their 5-gallon jerry cans with a funnel that let dirt into their engines, while the Americans had come up with an internal spout for clean and easy pouring. Ike ordered the 101st Screaming Eagles to Bastogne before they had time to even tie their shoes, and the Screaming Eagles arrived just before the Germans did, and held back their advance to the Meuse until the Bulge could be stopped at Saint-Vith. And after General Clark was ordered to do a slow retreat, Saint-Vith would be flattened by aerial bombing that made the locals hate the Americans. Bradley moved his headquarters to Namur for the 2 months following the Bulge. And when the Germans had first come into France in 1940, they'd come through the Ardennes right through Saint-Vith, but in the Battle of the Bulge, there would be no Rommel to get them to Dinant and over the Meuse River, as he had succeeded in doing with his 7th Panzer Division on day 4 of Hitler's march into France in May of 1940. Rommel's route had been given to Manteufel's 5th Panzer for the Battle of the Bulge, and the new Tiger II tanks burned a gallon of gas to get a half-mile down the road, and more in the mud. But the biggest problem for the Germans was that they kept running into roadblocks manned by Americans, even though Hitler had promised them all that the American troops had been ordered to retreat all the way back to the Meuse. Manteuffel and Sepp Dietrich had to continually back up to try to find ways around the American roadblocks, burning precious gasoline in their attempt. And Piper was already 16 hours behind schedule when he reached Malmedy at noon on day 2, where he was able to score 50,000 gallons of American gasoline by murdering U.S. soldiers because there was no time to take prisoners. Piper got stuck at Stavelot, trying to find a way across the Amblev River because the Americans had blown the bridges and were burning the remaining fuel dumps, and it had taken Piper 36 hours to go as far as they had gone in 9 hours in 1940. Piper found a bridge intact in Stavelot where the locals would build a monument to the 18th of December. But as he reached Troy Ponts, or 3 Points, the ferocity of the American defense made him think there were 10 times as many as the mere handful of soldiers defending that river junction. and Piper turned back to find a more open route to the Meuse and ran out of gas at L'Église, just as General James Gavin was arriving in force on the evening of day 4. The Luftwaffe tried to airdrop supplies to Piper on the 22nd, but the food and ammo fell into American hands, and Piper and his 800 men of the 6th Panzer abandoned their tanks and melted back through the woods into Germany. Manteuffel was supposed to have captured Saint-Vith on the evening of day 2. But the Americans had not gotten out of the way quickly enough when Monty ordered them to retreat to the Meuse, and Manteuffel's 5th Panzer was held up by the stubborn Americans who had heard that the Germans were no longer taking prisoners, but it was mostly the heavy snow that kept them in their prepared positions. Only the German General von Lüttwitz was still being cheered on toward the bridges over the Meuse that Monty was keeping open, and von Lüttwitz was a nobleman from Silesia accustomed to parleying surrender terms, and he was the one who had written the note requesting capitulation at Bastogne, to which General McAuliffe had replied, "Nuts." Von Lüttwitz bypassed Bastogne, where all the newspaper correspondents had been staying, leaving orders that the town was not to be destroyed because the newspaper people were needed to announce the imminent end of the war just as soon as von Lüttwitz met up with Monty for the formal signing. Even though the 47th Panzer Corps was a full day behind schedule, they got within sight of the Meuse and were overlooking the citadel at Dinant when the German offensive ground to a halt on Christmas Eve on day 9, due to the overwhelming American opposition in front of the British stationed at the Meuse bridges. Churchill would have to admit before Parliament that it had been an American victory. A speech broadcast over the radio by the BBC, because the citizenry of Greater Britain were demanding an explanation for why the British press had been lying to them about what was going on in Normandy, and they especially wanted to know why. The newspaper people at Bastogne had just been liberated by the Americans, if Monty was supposed to be in charge while the Americans were being described as flailing and weak and in desperate need of British help. Rommel had made it to the Meuse in 4 days, and had reached Houghton on day 3, where Clare Booth Luce wrote about the bridges over the Meuse River in 1940. That was May the 12th, then for 6 days the ugliest battle, and perhaps the one that mattered most in the world, convulsed the soil of Belgium and France and multiplied the population of hell. Holland fell, and Brussels. Emphasis. And the bridges on the Meuse were not blown up. Ah, the bridges on the Meuse were not blown up! Exclamation point. And emphasis. Emphasis hers. Europe in the Spring, page 245. The refugees remained at the stations for hurtful, lingering hours. Their papers had to be checked and rechecked by the police because Hitler was so clever he'd sent in many fifth columnists with them. The last day I went to the Gare du Nord was May 18. The Germans had broken through along the French border. An old Red Cross nurse, a French woman with a white face and staring eyes, put down the bowl of broth she was ladling out to the refugees. "Madame," she said, "are you an American?" I said yes, and she went on, "Then you must tell me the truth. Qui nous a trahi? Who has betrayed us?" I said, "Why do you say betrayed?" She said, weeping, "We have been betrayed." And she turned to ladle out more broth, suddenly dry-eyed. That was the first time I heard the word trahi, betrayed, in Paris. At first it was no more than a whisper, like the little winds that come in the dim days before the hurricane, in cafes, in bistros, in attics and conciergeries, in billets, and in the farms, trahi, trahi, and then the whisper became a great wail that swept through France, a great wail of the damned, trahi, trahi. Europe in the Spring, page 248 to 51. Alfred Duff Cooper said that day, "We may now expect an invasion at any time." What became the fear of the English became once again the hope of Frenchmen. But either way there was something which kept bothering the French as well as English. Why, it was asked, haven't the Germans really bombed Paris or London? The bars where the newsmen gathered became a hotbed of rumours that flew from lip to ear and ear to lip, so fast that a few hours later tout Paris knew them. On dit. The bridges on the Meuse were not blown up because fifth columnists disguised as priests and farmers entered the switch control huts, where loyal French soldiers stood waiting for the signal to blow them up and shot them in the back. On dit. Renaud and Churchill, who had flown to Paris the first day of the invasion, close parenthesis. Okay, on dit. Renaud and Churchill, parenthesis, who had flown to Paris the first day of the invasion, close parenthesis, had ordered Gamelin to send all the Allied shock troops and heavy artillery and tanks up into Flanders, and Gamelin had refused. He insisted that France's whole strategy had been based on defense, and he wished to let the Belgians and Dutch bear the brunt while he dug in on the Belgian frontier. Churchill and Renaud had prevailed. Gamelin was dismissed, and Weygand, advocate of the strong attack, had been sent for to implement a new strategy of attack. Europe in the Spring, page 256 and 7. The footnote read, "The first serious strategic error of the maneuver occurred on May 10 with the French army that left its trenches at England's demand and rushed into the lowlands and the fatal Battle of the Meuse." Then the terror of the fifth columnists began. I watched with fear the hatred of the French for the English growing by giant leaps and bounds. On May 28, the King of the Belgians surrendered. It was a very bitter day in Paris. Overnight, the quote-unquote brave Belgians, our allies, close quote, changed color in the eyes of Paris as they seemed to reflect the yellow of, quote, noble Leopold's action. Now everybody said, "We always knew he was pro-German. We always felt he was a traitor." A gendarme said to me bitterly, "His father was killed in an accident mountain climbing. His wife was killed in an automobile accident while he was driving." He put a sly finger to his nose. Accidents? I wonder now if they were accidents. Europe in the Spring, page 266 and 7. The footnote read, "That's what I'm wondering now about the automobile accident of Renaud and Helen de Portis, and the strange accident which killed General Belot, group commander of all the armies of the North, an hour after his secret meeting with Weygand in Flanders on May 25 to tell the new Generalissimo what had gone wrong in Flanders." The British headed for the Channel ports as soon as the French had marched into Flanders, leaving them alone to face the Germans, and by November of 1944, the French built 60-kilowatt mobile transmitters bolted inside vans for Ike's use that let the Americans speak directly to Washington without having to wait for a channel through London. That precious radio contact that had become unavailable during D-Day and during Market Garden. Operation Bodyguard had been to keep Patton out of the Normandy theatre, and he'd been kept away with the excuse that the British were doing a psyop so the Germans would concentrate their army around the Pas-de-Calais, 200 miles north of Caen and 20 miles down the coast from Dunkirk, rather than attacking the Americans during their wheel maneuver through France. When the British evacuated from Dunkirk on the 15th to the 25th of June in 1940, they left behind enough supplies for 10 divisions, carefully stashed in hidden warehouses and in secure underground bunkers that had been built during their 4-year stay during the Great War. As soon as Dunkirk was successfully evacuated, all the officers of the Polish army and Polish civilian leaders were massacred in the Katyn forest by murderers of unknown origin, and Ypres was 20 miles inland from Dunkirk, and Namur was 90 miles inland from Ypres. And when the hostilities ceased in June of 1940, Monty was sitting on the Albert Canal 25 miles upriver from Antwerp and 25 miles north of Brussels, 10 miles downriver from where the Meuse River joined the Albert Canal, and that junction was 50 miles downriver from Namur on the Meuse River. Patton always used a Michelin road map, and when the Americans took command of their own armies the day after Monty's Goodwood failed, Patton kicked the Germans out of their headquarters in Le Mans, through which ran the only railroad into France from Frankfurt. And Le Mans was where the Second Reich in Germany had begun when the French were crushed by Bismarck in January of 1871. The final defeat in the Franco-Prussian War had ended with the French surrendering at Sedan after being completely surrounded and cut off from their supply lines. And in those last few days, the French had lost an army of nearly 150,000 men, and Bismarck marched towards Paris and moved his headquarters to Versailles. In February of 1871, the Treaty of Versailles took Alsace and Lorraine away from France, who had to pay 5 milliards of francs to Germany for having lost the war. After Market Garden petered out, planning for the Bulge began in October of 1944, and the British hoped to get the French to rise up against the Americans by reporting that Ike had moved his headquarters to Versailles, just as Bismarck had done, but it was not to be. The British newspapers started a rumor that Ike was going to declare peace on the 11th of November in 1944, the same day as the armistice from the Great War, and the rumor was that Ike wanted to abandon the French to the Franco-British Union that France had declined on the 10th of May. In 1940, when Hitler had marched into France without the bridges over the Meuse being blown, the same bridges he wanted to use in the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. At first it was assumed that the Germans were attacking through Liège to the Channel ports and that the battle would swing in that direction to the north. As the Germans were turned back, however, and continued to thrust steadily westward, it became increasingly clear that there were two separate battles. Thus a line was drawn from Givet-on-the-Meuse to Saint-Vith. The armies north of that line would be under Montgomery's 21st Army Group, including, of course, the two U.S. armies, the 1st and the 9th. Montgomery lost no time in taking control of the battle. He had already had his phantom teams distributed at the various headquarters, keeping the situation under surveillance. Around 2:30 in the morning of December 20th, a British major presented himself at 1st Army headquarters to tell General Hodges that Montgomery was moving his 30 Corps to the west and behind the Meuse if needed. On the evening that I had dinner with the 1st Army staff, General Bill Keane, the 1st Army Chief of Staff, talked to me about his initial meeting with Montgomery. Montgomery told the Army commander that he wanted to bring together a corps for a counter-attacking force and to get it assembled promptly. He told 1st Army that he wanted the most aggressive corps commander they had, at the same time stipulating that he wanted Major General J. Lawton Collins, Lightning Joe. Collins had commanded the 7th Corps in the Utah Beach assault, and had moved very rapidly, swung his corps toward Cherbourg, and captured that major port ahead of schedule. Montgomery explained to Keane that he wanted Collins to be a savage rabbit. When asked what he meant, Montgomery explained that he wanted a corps to occupy a good defensive position and not to lose it, but every once in a while, when the moment seemed opportune, the corps was to rush and nip the German panzers, then fall back into its prepared defensive positions. Collins reported to the First Army commander on December 21st, and by December 24 he believed he would be ready to attack. Already 2 of his divisions, the 3rd Armored and the 84th Infantry, were engaged. The 2nd Armored Division was to be on his right, and it, as the tactics developed, was destined to be the quote-unquote savage rabbit, a role not particularly to its liking. The 2nd Armored had been fighting since Sicily, and it was a veteran-proved division. If it became engaged, it would be certain to want to destroy its opponent rather than withdraw after a short encounter. Already the German 2nd Panzer Division had moved to within a few miles of the Meuse River and seemed to be enjoying considerable freedom of action. The 2 left divisions of the 7 Corps were involved in a heavy defensive action. On December 24, General Harmon, commanding the 2nd Armored, asked permission to commit a combat team of his division against the 2nd Panzer, which had been identified in the neighborhood of the small towns of Ciney and Celles. Harmon had committed another combat command farther to the east. Some discussion ensued with Army headquarters and Army in turn with Montgomery. Montgomery had hoped to organize a corps size counterattacking force that would be well to the rear and kept free of any involvement until the moment its attack was to be made. Unfortunately, the Germans' successful move west had already involved 2 of the divisions of the Corps, the 3rd Armor and the 84th Infantry. Further, a combat command of Harmon's 2nd Armor became involved, as the First Army front extended towards the Meuse. Montgomery therefore talked about disengaging the 2nd Armor and withdrawing it well to the rear to have it in a position to protect Liège if necessary, but Harmon had tasted battle and found it to his liking. His combat command A handled the Germans very roughly, and he had a hunch that the German spearhead, now so close to the Meuse, was bogged down and in trouble. He therefore wanted to attack with his remaining combat command and his reconnaissance battalion. General Collins had to make the decision. He told Harmon to go. The attack was launched on the morning of December 25. Harmon said that he wanted to take the Panzer out of the German 2nd Panzer Division. The Panzers were overextended and many of their vehicles were without fuel. After the battle, the 2nd Armored Division claimed that it had destroyed or captured 82 tanks, 16 other armored vehicles, 83 guns, and 280 motor vehicles. Harmon had taken the Panzer out of the 2nd Panzer Division. That was the high point and the end of the von Rundstedt offensive. On to Berlin, page 273-6. Soon after the Bulge, Ike had a falling out with his British girlfriend Kate Summersby and gave orders that she no longer be allowed within range of the Supreme Commander. And Ike concentrated on banning all British intelligence because he'd gotten wind of their upcoming Operation Eclipse that he had heard about from communist spies embedded with the British. And the Eclipse meant to have Monty use the American 82nd and 101st Airborne dropped into airfields in Berlin, after which Patton would have no choice but to march to Berlin to save them. Hearing this, Ike had reneged on his promise to Monty that Patton would not move forward until the 10th of November, and when Kate Summersby was banned from the Americans' headquarters, she was done the favor of hearing it personally from Ike. As the Bulge was being flattened out, the British newspapers renewed their attack on the Americans as weak and in need of Monty's command, and the temporary change in command given to Monty with the 1st and the 9th during the Bulge was now demanded by Monty to become permanent. The newspapers reported that once the enemy had been turned back, Monty was depicted as St. George come to save the American command from disaster. As if this were not already irritating enough, the British press suddenly erupted in a rash of comment that attributed the Bulge to our lack of unified ground command. Once again, the British revived the proposal that Montgomery be named as deputy to Eisenhower for super command of all ground forces. Bradley, page 473. By January, the Americans had 50 divisions in the theater to the 15 divisions of British, and the Russians were supposed to have started their final offensive towards Berlin on the 20th of December. But Stalin had held off until after the Bulge to see how it came out. Churchill called Stalin on the 6th of January and told him to go ahead with the attack on Berlin, hoping the Americans would see that a separate peace was desperately needed to stop the Russians. The Red Army was at last gaining headway on its offensive after a 3-month layoff that lasted through our Battle of the Bulge. If we could only have attacked concurrently with the Soviet drive, the enemy would have been unable to shuttle reinforcements between the East and West Front. Bradley, page 492. On the 31st of December, the Germans launched Operation Baseplate and Operation North Wind that would last until the 30th of January in 1945. And Operation Dentist was to follow right after North Wind, a plan for the Germans to annihilate Patton's Third Army in a pincer movement around Strasbourg. And Dentist had been personally designed by Hitler. Baseplate began on the 1st of January as the Luftwaffe bombed 16 Allied airfields using hundreds of planes that destroyed 500 Allied aircraft, while the Germans lost 300 planes. But most of those German aircraft had been shot down by Germans who had not been informed about Baseplate. This would be the Luftwaffe's last hurrah, although the attack on the Maldegem airfield would have done much less damage had Monty not ordered the anti-aircraft defenses moved in December. North Wind set off at the same time as Baseplate and was similarly the German Army's last offensive, hitting the American 7th Army around Strasbourg and causing 25,000 casualties to the Americans before petering out on the 25th of January. And another 25,000 American soldiers were hospitalized because of the cold weather. As Baseplate got underway, Ike had ordered Monty to move south to meet Patton, who was coming up north, and they were supposed to meet at Hoffeleis, to cut off the Hufeleis. They were supposed to meet at Hufeleis to cut off the Germans remaining in the Bulge, forcing them to surrender, but Monty refused to start moving until the 3rd of January, allowing the majority of the Germans to escape back into the fatherland. While Churchill was giving his speech in the House of Commons, saying that the Bulge had been an American victory, the British codebreakers at Bletchley swore they'd heard nary a whisper about any preparations for the Bulge. The British Operation Veritable had been planned for early January, when the ground was still frozen so tanks and trucks could move easily over the hard ground, but was now postponed by Monty until the ground could thaw, and Veritable was supposed to be a pincer movement using Monty's forces up north coming down to meet the Americans under his command to the south. But first Monty ordered the Big Red One back to its previous sector above Aachen, back into the floodplain of the Rower Dams, and on the second day of Veritable, the Germans blew the Rower Dams and flooded out the Americans, stranding them there for 2 weeks. Simpson made it across after those 2 weeks while the river was still high, and that had surprised the Germans because the bridging material from America was new to the Normandy theater, and the Americans were able to replace their mobile bridging as quickly as Monty was borrowing it. In previous war planning, battles had revolved around bridges, and being able to build bridges so quickly had put a real wrench in the works. Veritable was the very same operation planned earlier as Operation Wyvern, but Monty had put it off during the Bulge, and now Veritable was brought back for the 8th of February, and it would last until the 11th of March. Veritable had originally been planned back on the 7th of December, but with the name Valedictorian. And while Northwind was failing at the end of January in 1945, the Russians overran Auschwitz. Hitler had ordered Himmler on the 25th of January to take his special train to Schneidemühl in northern Poland to wait at the major railroad junction between Bromberg and Stettin and Posen, all three having double-track rail lines, and there Himmler was to wait for delivery of the treasure gathered from all the Jew looting that had been stored at various camps and subcamps now being shut down as the Red Army wave washed up into Poland towards Berlin. Himmler's train was to take all the gold to a secret location for safekeeping until the British could convince the Americans that they needed to get into a shooting war with Russia to save the Germans from the unholy Jewish Bolshevism. And that scenario solved the mystery of why the railway lines to the camps weren't bombed, lest all that treasure be irretrievably lost if the Americans won the war. Auschwitz was liberated by the Russians on the 27th of January, and London thought the Russians would help by murdering all the inmates, but the Germans had already moved the camp prisoners from in front of the advancing Red Army because as soon as a deal was cut with Britain, the concentration camp workers would be needed in pursuit of the war against Russia. As cover for Himmler's mission waiting in his train at Schneidemühl, Hitler gave him the new army of the Vistula that was cobbled together from several battered units, and they were defending the train while it waited for the gold booty to arrive. But Guderian got wind of it and wanted those troops transferred to his friend Maximilian Maria Joseph Karl Gabriel Lamoral Reichsfreiherr von Unzuweichs Onderglan, who had been part of von Bock's Army Group Center during Operation Barbarossa. Guderian started asking questions when Himmler's train had sat immobile on a siding for 2 weeks without doing anything, and Guderian had been born in Prussia and had fought in the Great War, and Guderian had been in the Battle of Moscow when Barbarossa had failed due to the Rasputitsa, and seeing Himmler's train not moving made Guderian knock on the door of Himmler's train on the 9th of February to make inquiries. Guderian had been fired on Christmas Day in 1941 when the Prussian Eastern Railway had been unable to deliver winter supplies to Guderian's men freezing to death outside Moscow. And here was Himmler sitting on those same tracks that had failed to bring relief to the German army during Barbarossa. There were 13 of these command trains used by the chiefs of the German military, and Edward and Wallace had been taken on one of them during their visit to Germany in 1937. And Himmler's train was called the Sonderzug Steiermark or the Sonderzug Heinrich, but it had been renamed the Transport 44 when he started using it to pick up special prisoners for a deal in 1944 he was making with Sweden to ransom selected prisoners from the concentration camps and transport them aboard Himmler's special train to the port of Hamburg. Hitler's train was called the Sonderzug Amerika until he began calling it the Sonderzug Brandenburg in preparation for the Bulge. The German word Sonder meant special, and Zug meant train, and Steiermark was the name of the Austrian homeland where Himmler had been born. The name Brandenburg came from the German word meaning forest fortress, and Brandenburg was at the heart of the Holy Kingdom of Prussia, although some historians claimed the origin of the name Brandenburg meant city of fire. Also in preparation for the Bulge, Himmler had been put in command of Oberkommando Oberrhein, or the Army of the Upper Rhine, that had been created on the 26th of November in 1944, and would be disbanded on the 25th of January when Himmler was ordered to take his train to Schneidemühl to wait for delivery of the Reich treasure, guarded by the newly formed Army of the Vistula. The Army of the Upper Rhine had answered directly to Hitler, and when Himmler was put in charge of it on the 10th of December, he had been in command of the armies facing Patton during the Bulge. Himmler could have had all the Germans stand down with a snap of his fingers as soon as the Bulge reached the Meuse River and Monty signed the separate peace, and with that, it would have been hours rather than days before Patton completely ran out of ammo and gas. The Second Reich had been born in the same region where Patton faced Himmler's Army of the Upper Rhine, and the birth of the Second Reich in 1871 had come about under the exact same state of affairs as was being presented to Patton, and the difficult part for Patton was that he knew it with a dead certainty. London, Sunday, July 19, 1942. Ike, Clark, and I had lunch with Steve at Claridge's. Steve was much taken by both the CG and Clark. Incidentally, the PM calls the tall, lanky, sharp-nosed Clark, quote, the American Eagle. Don't know what he calls Ike. Steve told me after lunch that the PM had raised holy hell with Harry because the precise protocol of calling upon the Prime Minister first had for some reason not been followed, and discussion had started informally among General Marshall, Admiral King, and various members of the British General Staff. The PM had declared in most vigorous language as he strode up and down the room at Chequers that he was the man to see first, that he was the man America should deal with, and that the British Army-Navy staffs were under his command. And to emphasize his authority, he read from a British book of war laws, and, as Steve put it, as he read each page, tore it from the book and threw it on the floor! Exclamation point. The PM had said that the party should have been handled so that he personally met the American delegation at the railway station. Anyway, late in the day, Ike finished the draft of the basic proposals for Marshall and King to present to the British, and we waited at the apartment during the evening for word from Marshall, if there were to be any changes. Presently, an officer came with the proposal as slightly revised by Marshall and King, and with a handwritten note from Marshall to Ike to take a look at their changes and to polish the language if necessary. There had been no change in the meaning, but some of the fire of Ike's pungent language had been toned down. General Clark was with us. Ike phoned Marshall to say that he had no further suggestions. The proposal was for a second front in France by October of this year, brackets 1942. To help the Russians. These are momentous days! Exclamation point. Nearly forgot to mention that Ike, Clark, and I listened at the office to Ed Murrow's broadcast on the BBC Home Service from 6:30 to 6:40 this afternoon. Ed painted Ike as a representative of the, quote, great American middle class, close quote. Ike got a chuckle out of Ed's line, quote, I don't know whether Eisenhower is a good general or not, close quote. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 24 and 5. London, Saturday, September 5, 1942. Churchill agrees to the military layout, quote, as you propose it, close quote. He volunteered that since the British troops have already trained for landing, he would be willing that they wear the American uniform, and added, quote, they will be proud to do so, close quote. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 86. London, Monday, September 7, 1942. Refreshed and revigorated by 3 nights of good rest at the cottage, brackets, me too, the CG today cabled the Operations Division, WD, that with substantial agreements reached, all preparations can proceed, quote, unhampered by the uncertainties and changing conceptions, close quote, that have been perplexing planners. The planners may be perplexed, but no more than I, and I'm worried as well. A page of the diary is missing. Emphasis. It's the page of the first torch directive to Ike to clean up the North African coast, close parenthesis. End emphasis. If some enemy spy had managed to get that sheet, all our hope of attaining surprise is already in vain. In merging the official and personal items into one set of pages, many pages had to be recopied and renumbered. This the faithful Miss Jacqua has been doing for many long days. The loss was discovered during the process of microfilming. I had sent Miss Jacqua, Corporal Marshal, parenthesis, General Ike's personal stenographer, close parenthesis, and Mickey with sidearms to the Army's film laboratory to do the job. In the process, page 117 was discovered missing, just wasn't there. Although there seems no other conceivable way for the sheet to get out of our offices, which are guarded not only by the Marines at the entrances, but by guards in the commanding general's outer office day and night, the darn page is gone. We searched and researched, but no page 117. It must have been discarded and burned in the secret stuff Miss Jacqua had finished copying, but that's not definite. First loss of B-17s operating over enemy territory occurred Sunday. Butcher, page 89 to 90. The footnote read, there was a loss previously before General Ike assumed command. Fortresses of early design, bombed submarine pens on the French coast, and we suffered a high percentage of loss. From this trial, some British writers, as well as professional airmen, became skeptical of the widely heralded American bomber and the idea of daylight precision bombing. But from this experience, the belly turret was developed, and firepower of the B-17 generally increased. London, Wednesday, September 9, 1942. As Ike and Clark had anticipated, the PM now is insistent upon setting a date for the attack. When the PM questioned him, Ike declared November 8, 60 days from today. The PM was disappointed. He is so anxious to see operation underway. Parenthesis, planners still aiming at November 4, close parenthesis. Ike made clear to the PM that with the plan now set for use of American regimental combat teams from the UK, it is necessary to equip them so that the units will be appropriately balanced. This takes time and the men must be trained. The PM, seeking haste, again suggested that British soldiers, more advanced in their training than Americans, be used in American uniforms, and reiterated that he would be, quote, proud to have 'em wear 'em, close quote. But Ike said that the sham would soon be discovered and would undermine confidence in the whole American operation. Thought the PM was disappointed at his decision. Asked Ike if the PM had mentioned the fine repertorial job he'd done in speaking in Commons during the day. Did he? He read most of it to us. While the PM was directing his dinner conversation for a moment to General Clark, Ike seized the opportunity to release a suppressed yawn, only to have the PM turn suddenly toward him and catch him at it. Clark has in mind that Algiers will be the best place for the general headquarters. Brigadier Mockler Ferriman, G2, had said there was nothing to be gained by disguising U.S. pilots or other personnel, or by concealing their presence at Gibraltar. He recommends that U.S. markings be placed on British aircraft any time after the pilots arrive at Gib, and it would be well to have a limited number of visits by U.S. air transports prior to D-Day, brackets in North Africa, close brackets, so that the heavy concentration on and around D-Day will not be so noticeable. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 95-7. London, Thursday, September 10, 1942. General Clark's report, covering the activities at Norfolk House for September 9, relates that Colonel Sterling of the Secretariat of the British Chiefs of Staff had called and reiterated that the PM is pressing the chiefs for early action and wanted to know the limiting factors that prevent the D-Day from being set earlier than the first week of November. In answering his query, Clark cited the non-arrival of equipment for the 1st Division, lack of maintenance supplies, unbalanced stocks, the date of arrival of the combat teams from the U.S., conversion of combat loaders, and completion of auxiliary carriers in the U.S. Clark also added that the schedule for amphibious training for the 2 RCTs of the 1st Division indicated that they would be finished around October 8. Emphasized that we must have rehearsals, and again stated that we are unwilling to put British soldiers into American uniforms. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 98. London, Friday, October 9, 1942. A new point given to General Clark by Colonel Sterling today is that the British are prepared to have the Allied Commander-in-Chief head up military control of Gibraltar itself during the assault, but such an unprecedented move requires cabinet approval. Colonel Sterling had also shown General Clark a Joint Intelligence Committee paper dated October 6, indicating that no particular attention is being paid to Allied preparations by the Axis. Clark describes this as, quote, quite encouraging, close quote. Clark, with 2 or 3 officers, plans to leave Gibraltar as soon as practicable after D-Day for Oran, going thence to Algiers and later backtracking to Casablanca to, quote, tie up both ends of the American effort, close quote. Parenthesis, I don't think General Ike could be successfully tied to the Rock of Gibraltar after the assault is underway. My guess is that he will be on the heels of the assault force. He has constantly grumbled at being cooped up in a cave in Gibraltar, and he has tried to establish his headquarters on a cruiser. Unfortunately, the critical need of communications and the limitations of receiving and sending messages from a cruiser bars such an arrangement. Gibraltar is satisfactory as a communications center, close parenthesis. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 138. London, Saturday, October 10, 1942. A matter that has concerned Anderson is his feeling that the inhabitants of Algiers might rightly feel that they had been deliberately double-crossed by public statements, by leaflets, broadcasts, and in the press, into thinking the Eastern assault is an all-American operation. Actually, as the inhabitants will see by looking around, there will be British troops in the Algiers region. The CG directed General Clark to study the matter and arrange for the preparation and distribution of a separate leaflet to be given out some hours after the landing is effected, explaining the nature of the British participation. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 139. 8 days after the Germans withdrew from El Alamein on the 11th of November in 1942, Stalin ordered the Russian counteroffensive against Germany. 11 days after the Americans landed in North Africa, and while the British marched towards Egypt to seize the Suez Canal, Stalin surrounded the Germans at Stalingrad. By the time the Germans did the Bulge in December of 1944, Antwerp had been opened by the Americans, but supplies were still not forthcoming because Monty was demanding all available supplies for his march towards Berlin through Hanover.